Chapter 20. I didn't know what hit me when I took a header immediately upon stepping out the door. You have fallen. 5 HP. You have 20 HP remaining. A huge ogre stepped over me, glancing down with such utter contempt you'd think he'd stepped in dog shit. "Watch where going, half-man," he grumbled. I scowled but doubted he even noticed as he went on his way. A woman tutted as she passed by before I even regained my feet. I scanned my vitality score, 5. With a maximum of 25 hit points total, it didn't take a genius to figure out the attribute score times 5 equaled my total hit points. But after the fall, my health pool sat at 20. Before I even absorbed that bit of enlightenment, I recovered my HP in 2 quick bursts. You have recovered 4 HP. 1 second later, you have recovered 1 HP. My recovery score was 4. So maybe that correlated to the exact amount of HP I could recover per second. It would make the system less mysterious and would make sense as the number climbed with each level. The halfling mentor didn't mention whether recovery could be affected by actions other than leveling. Maybe it was linked to vitality, and maybe it wasn't. Resting might help. It would follow real-life logic. Not that that was something to bet on in a world full of green ogres to knock you on your ass. Another jaw-popping yawn stretched my face, and I knew I'd need to make a decision. Despite my earlier experience, I still had no way to figure out how the citizens of the world would react to an 8 disappearing from the street. But upon reflection, they probably had it wiped from their minds. Compared to the hyper-realism and crazy environmental detail their machinery had to manage to pull off a world like Mafioso Online, wiping a 3-second interaction in a given radius when a player logged out from an NPC's virtual brain was likely cake. I decided to put it to the test, and the countdown timer began. This time, I didn't slip into an alley. The machinery whirred as the door opened on rails, then I raised my visor. If I'd expected to find my comrades sitting on the sofa waiting for me to emerge, I quickly learned the opposite. Not only weren't they in the room, but the whole place was empty. I'd left through the secret wall, keeping it propped open with a shoe since Brenner hadn't left me the code, then searched the entire residence. Every door down the long hallway, the backyard beyond the sliding glass. Then I spied the note on the mantel over the fireplace scribbled on a sticky pad. Couldn't believe they still made those things, but it had proven its worth by being there. Went into town for supplies. Need to stock up on food and rubbing alcohol. Can't wait to burn the shit out of you with the latter. Brenner great. I'd logged out for nothing. I opened the fridge to find empty metal shelves, except for a half-filled 20-ounce bottle of orange juice I didn't dare open. I decided to drop into the pod for a nap before logging back in. Chapter 21. Jack Carruthers. We know about the cash rental, Jack. Kid at the counter was very forthcoming once he realized we had his number. Pocket full of dope. Not smart in that state. The guy in the standard issue suit stood with his hands in his pockets, eyeing Jack over the top of his sunglasses. Also standard issue. He could have come straight from the Fed factory, Jack mused. I wanted to go for a drive. Winter's not kind to sweet rides like mine. She's an antique. It made sense. The woman he'd bound in Brenner's first hideaway stood in the back corner, her face cast in shadow as she watched. When Jack shifted his gaze toward her, the dude who was doing the talking snapped his fingers to draw his focus. We grabbed the rental from the parking lot near the grocery. Looks like someone bled in the passenger seat. That our witness? Is he dead? Yep, deader in shit. Had to burn the body. Bullshit. Where did that drive take you, Jackie boy? Visiting old friends? The second agent pushed off the wall. She strolled into the light as she paced in a slow circle, checking out all his angles. Pound sand. I don't have to tell you shit. You know it'd help, Tanner. Just give us a clue and we won't say how we found out. Jack let out a snort of faux amusement. You can't hold me, so let's wrap this up. You detained a federal agent, douchebag. We can throw your ass in the pen. Jack held out his hands with his wrists facing the ceiling. Cuff me, big man, but you aren't getting shit. The female agent strolled around the metal table, then dragged a chair to one side. No, we won't be pressing charges. I can understand why you did what you did. I mean, you didn't know me from Eve. How would you know the Rossies didn't send me, right? The good cop has arrived. Fine, Jack would play. They've done worse. She gave a subtle, single dip of her chin. Exactly why we need Tanner Jacobs to put them where they belong. Talk about delusions. Jack leaned forward so their faces were about a foot apart. You must think I'm stupid. Rossi could lose his entire top end and he'd still be in business, especially with the Jaworski deals. There's no end to the flow of money. Tanner has better ideas about how to do things. She folded her arms across her chest, then leaned away from him to rest her back against the chair. But I thought Tanner was dead and burned to ashes. What? Is he going rogue? Doing it himself? How smart is that? You're not getting shit. Arrest me or get out of my way. I have things to do. Things? Jack fixed her with a dull smile. You're cutting into my me time. He gave her a nice, slow once-over. And you've given me the perfect image for it. He made a fist, then flicked his wrist above his crotch a few times. Tanner wouldn't have approved, but fuck her for trying to manipulate him. Well, we can't compete with that, she said dryly, gesturing to the door of the first-floor office. Do let us know if you hear from Tanner. I'd hate for anything to happen, to either of you. Oh, will do, right away. He shot her a wink. Sorry about earlier. Amused by how swiftly he'd slipped that noose, Jack pushed open the glass door and pulled his shades down as he exited to the street, mind on getting back to his ride and checking in with Brenner. He had a list of things to ask him about, now that he'd had time to think over the situation with Tanner. A couple blocks up the street, he turned left. Now that they'd taken the rental, he'd have to grab another to get back to the cabin. But they'd follow him, and he needed a plan. Luckily, Brenner had slipped out of sight when the feds caught Jack in the store, but he'd be just as stranded. The feds had been too stupid to commandeer Jack's handheld. He was just reaching for it to call the Nerd King, when a blur of motion led to a hood being yanked down over his head so fast, he barely got a look at the four men that bagged him and tossed him into a van. One of them cracked him on the head, then it was lights out. A swift fist across the jaw welcomed Jack back to consciousness. Little lights danced against the insides of his eyelids before they fluttered open. We aren't in Fed territory anymore, Dorothy. He took another hard shot to the chin. His head bounced back against the cinderblock wall with a melon-like thunk. A seesaw battle between focus and blur erupted, faces around him morphing like aliens. The dingy basement came and went, but when his gaze fell on the bloody figure slumped in a chair across the room, his temples thumped madly and the view cleared. Brenner. They'd found him when the feds failed. His hands jerked to rub at his stinging face, but the raw sensation circling his wrists announced they were bound behind the crude wooden chair. His hands jerked to rub at his stinging face, but the raw sensation circling his wrists announced they were bound behind the crude wooden chair. The sharp scents of bleach, piss, must, and blood stung his nose. The tiny windows were all shut, trapping them with the smells. He dipped his head to rub his nose against his shoulder to relieve the itch, only to leave a trail of blood on his shirt. There was an old, scarred workbench under the window, holding a variety of ominous tools. No doubt they'd show off the toys before putting them to use. Psyops. What? He spat blood. I said, where the fuck is Tanner Jacobs? A man screamed in his face, spit flying. A jacket hung on a vacant chair behind, and his shirt sleeves were rolled past the elbows. Little splatters of red dotted his paisley tie. How should I know? Haven't seen him since after he was discharged. Try again. He walloped Jack a third time, targeting the cheekbone just under his eye where it would swell nicely. I don't know what you mean. I thought the feds had him. Speaking of the feds, Jack could not believe he'd allowed himself to be nabbed by these dangerous assholes after just leaving federal custody. Try again. The guy held up his handheld to show a photo of Tanner through the rear window of the rental from when Jack drove down a street glaring with neon. You got me. Last I saw him, he was reading poetry to your mom at her whorehouse. Wham! This punch came from the other side. Lightning. His eyes leaked involuntarily. He took 2 more shots to the face in quick succession, then someone else whacked a length of rebar across his knees. Pain sang up and down his legs, joining in the chorus from his face. His legs wanted to straighten, but they, too, were bound to the chair. "He can hit harder, if you'd prefer busted kneecaps. Now tell me where Jacobs is." The second guy spun the rebar like a baton, then stepped back to center like he was about to use Jack's head as a T-ball. He looked eager to play. Brenner squirmed in his seat. He didn't move much, tied as he was at wrists and ankles, but he did his best. "Fuck, stop! I'll tell you where he is, just stop!" Jack shot him a bitter glare through slitted, swollen eyes. "You'll tell them exactly shit! They're going to kill us anyway, B!" "No, I will. I'll tell you. I'll tell you. It's not like you can hurt him anyways." That was when Jack caught the game. For all the times their brains seemed to be linked, he'd never understood how two people, who were so different in every way, thought almost exactly the same as often as they did. Shit. Genius. His turn to play. "Fuck, Brenner, shut the hell up!" Brenner spilled the lie through cracked, puffy lips still dripping blood. "He was shot by one of those fucks on the Upper East. We shoved him in a pod in a place where I used to run a gamer's lounge before those Goombas moved in and tried to charge me protection. We knew Infinity Designs had drawn people in the throes of death into their game worlds before, so we hoped it would work. It didn't. We hid his body in the mountains." Brennard had the same resistance training against interrogation Jack and Tanner had, and despite his leaner stature and a weaker resistance to pain, he'd come through. But the fun hadn't even started yet. The question was, could he hold? It was one thing for them to whack Jack, but when he thought about someone as smart and capable as Brenner being wiped from the world, heat that had nothing to do with the hits he'd taken filled his cheeks. The Nerd King had never been scoped by the enemy before, never been tortured as he sat at a forward base and relayed info or hacked into opposition resources. But he'd proven out. That's more like it. See, that wasn't so hard, was it? This guy was enjoying having the floor. He strutted between the captives while the rest stood at the ready to deliver more punishment. "But I can't really take you word for it, can I?" He turned to Mr. Rebar. The guy nodded. "Yeah, they've done it 100 times since Enora Online. Same tech as all those people who pay to transfer their consciousnesses into computer worlds. The system's been known to yank the dying into it. Company that runs it doesn't like lawsuits. Easier and cheaper to sort it out after." Mr. Fists slipped his hand into a pocket. He withdrew an old-fashioned silver coin, the kind that hadn't been in circulation in, forever. "Yeah, but could it fail?" Rebar smiled. "Doubt it. Been doing it for a couple decades at this point." "So maybe the little one is telling half-truths? Maybe they tossed him in that pod thing and it worked." "Possible." He whipped around to face Brenner. "What game were you trying to leak his brain into?" "Enora," Rebar interjected. "Nah, daughter tried that old thing. Said it was too harsh. Only the really hardcore ones play that anymore." Fists shook his head. "Last try, man." Brenner raised his head and leveled his gaze on the guy. "Enora Online, I told you. No one would look for him there for the reason your guy just said. Too old, too hardcore." The goons shared a look, then a mutual nod. "Fine. Now you two got into the middle of some shit, family shit. But you didn't betray us like your friend Jacobs. I'm a fair man, but some things, well, the boss has to keep face. Send messages when people bullshit. You know how it is." So casual, so matter-of-fact. He flipped the coin, watching it glint in the scant light of the bare bulbs, then caught it against the back of one hand. "You want to call it?" He glanced at Brenner, palm still covering the coin. Jack swallowed his racing heart, fists clenched behind him, teeth gritted hard enough to make his jaw ache under all the inevitable bruising. His chair creaked beneath him, worn by so many stressful scenes, perhaps. "What's that? I didn't hear you." The ringleader's lips tightened over a mean grin. "Fuck you!" Jack spat. The man shrugged as if it made no difference to him, no skin off his teeth. He glanced down at the coin, pocketed it, then strolled over behind the battered nerd. Just as casually as he'd tossed the coin, he drew a knife across Brenner's throat, ear to ear. Skin separated, then blood erupted forth and ran down the front of Brenner's already ruined shirt and pants. Brenner convulsed and gurgled while the blood streamed toward the floor drain in the middle of the room. You motherfucker! Jack howled. You son of a bitch! Tell you a secret, the fucker said as he avoided the pooling blood on his way back across the concrete room. I was always going to pick him for the knife. He looked weak, and this world is for the strong. Didn't want to listen to him cry. But you... Jack huffed with rage, tremors running up and down his limbs as he measured the situation. Two headed for the stairs, the one with the rebar lingering nearby with an eager glint in his eyes. The ringleader leveled the bloody knife at him, his smile mean. Kill him, with your fists if you please. Send the video over to the Bianchis to show them we aren't scared of them. Next time they shoot at someone we're targeting instead of capturing him like we ask, well, it's always good to send reminders. He paused on the bottom stair as though in thought. His bodyguard trailed him like an oversized pup, pausing when he did. And make it clear video. You know, for posterity and shit. The goon grunted in acknowledgement as the boss took his leave, tossing the rebar aside where it rattled and clanked against the concrete. He approached a camera set on a tripod to ready the equipment. This is it, Jack. You're going to get one shot. Jack slammed the chair back against the cinderblock wall. It shattered at the joints. Another bash, and he spilled to the floor, shaking off the remnants of the wooden furniture. He tucked his burning, swelling knees for a try at getting loose, but the guy came too fast. Despite the pain in his own leg, Jack lashed out with one boot and received a satisfying crunch from the guy's knee. Music to his fucking ears. Served him right. A knee for a knee. The goon landed like a stuffed sack, yelping, and Jack used the moment to roll back, knees to his chest so he could slip his bound wrists down under his ass and out to the front of his feet. He sprang at the cussing goon still skidding in Brenner's blood and caught his neck with the rope binding him. This is for Brenner, you fuck! He yanked the rope tight, brought the guy up to his knees, then planted his own into his back for leverage. Gonna snap your fucking neck, you piece of shit! He snarled feral rage as he leaned into it, shoving his kneecap into the man's spine as his body bucked, legs thrashing beneath him. Then that purple, clotted face stared blankly at nothing while Jack scrambled to the workbench for a knife to free himself from the ropes. He tucked the blade behind his belt when he stopped to get his bearings, clenching and unclenching his fists to get the blood flowing again. He tilted his head, closed his eyes. No sound from upstairs. If anyone lingered, they didn't realize they'd heard the sound of the wrong guy dying. Whatever the case, he had to get gone, and high windows were a better bet than fighting his way out and into an unknown location with potential hostiles upstairs wielding a variety of weapons. Probably guns. Like they say, you don't take a knife to a gunfight. He climbed onto the workbench, unlatched the window, then propped it up so he could angle his shoulders through. Damn, it was tight. Thoughts of facing the unknowns upstairs had him wriggling harder, and his foot knocked a heavy wrench down with a loud clatter. Jack didn't wait to see if anyone might investigate. He just heaved himself desperately through, raking his side against the splintered frame.